The bar smelled of citrus and old wood, of lemon oil on the counter, and the small, stubborn warmth that gathered around the cluster of lamps above the long bar. Shi Yue moved along it in a gray apron, her hands steady from long shifts, her voice low when she answered orders. She kept her head down more than most. There was shyness there that had hardened into habit. People who didn't know her called it modesty. Those who had seen her at the hospital called it tiredness. Tonight, both words fit. On the far side, beneath a row of framed Polaroids and a faded neon sign that read October in pale pink, a table of men laughed too loudly, steering their elbows as if the room belonged to them. They were the kind who measured worth by the tilt of a glass and the width of a cuff. One of them nudged at a woman with lacquered nails, and the woman leaned forward and tossed a remark like a pebble. "Look at her," she said, voice sharp with a practiced cruelty. "Who'd think someone like that could even— what does she do? Wait tables? Clean up after the wealthy? It's almost cute." The man who'd made the pebble remark smirked. "Cute and desperate," he supplied. "She must be eating garbage every night." She wiped a glass, feeling the ache behind her eyes and the instantaneous reflex to shrink. She had been schooled to disappear, to take less, to ask less, to make every small kindness she offered appear as if it cost her nothing. 10 years ago, she had learned that endurance earns quiet rewards. 10 years later, the rewards were not nearly enough. A figure detached from the entrance like a shadow finding its place in the room. Tall, composed, the sharp line of a coat, and a presence that made the laughter soften at its edges. Lu Xinyan moved through the bar as if he had been the bar's architect, not its patron, assessing, calculating the light, the angles of conversation. He had the detached charisma of someone used to being recognized and applauded. At the same time, his face held a private restraint, like a portrait that had not yet been asked to smile. She felt his gaze before she understood it. A thread slipped somewhere inside her, an old, unspooled memory. 10 years ago, the words jumped like a skipped beat, a name. He looked at her, and recognition struck him in a place that had nothing to do with public image. Shi Yue? His voice cut through the small clamor, not loud, but precise. The men at the table turned. The lacquered nails woman frowned as if she had misheard. She froze, a tray in her hands, held like a shield. Lu's mouth softened once, only once, and then he closed it. He stepped forward, his eyes not leaving her. He had spent years moving through rooms full of people who admired him from a distance. Finding this particular woman here, behind a bar she might have swept, rearranged the room for him. "I've been looking for you for 10 years, he said, and the words landed. There was a throttle of private history in them, recognition, apology, accusation, but mostly something like an ache that demanded explanation in the open air. The lacquered woman laughed, an edge of derision. "Oh, please, who hasn't he been searching for? Another trophy? Another stunt?" A hum of gossip swelled. The men began to nudge each other, eyes bright with the prospect of spectacle. People loved surprise, especially when it came wearing dresses of shame. But Lu's attention did not turn to spectacle. He reached for his pocket, producing a card, businesslike, implacable. But he did not give it to Shi. Instead, he pushed a glass of water in front of her, fingers brushing her knuckles in a way that made heat climb her wrist. "Sit," he said. It was an order to the room as much as to her, and in the other faces the air tightened. The lacquered woman's smile thinned. She sat on the high stool by reflex, the wood cold under the thin sleeve of her apron. Her back was straight, though her shoulders trembled. The room had contracted. The neon glowed an accusing pink. She did not know if the card in his hand signified business or apology or a forgotten life being unfolded. She did not know if it mattered. For the moment, she only knew the name that had arrived with him, Lu Xinyan, and the history that the name opened like a wound that had learned to close. Lu, someone said, as if the name required reassurance. Shi Yue, Lu repeated, and he took off his coat, draped it over the back of a chair beside her. You look the same, he said, simply. It was a dangerous phrase. It announced memory. It refused to allow the night's cruel small talk to remain unexamined. Voices tried to steer the moment back to ridicule. Isn't she that scientist woman? Another man guessed, turning the social wheel to fit his comforts. Wasn't she in some project, or am I thinking of someone else? She opened her mouth. For a second, years folded over themselves. She had become a person who had two lives. By day, she wrote code and negotiated with investors. And by night, she kept a bar's fragile economy afloat to pay for a child's medication, to buy a tender hospital bed, to make the impossible modestly possible. There had been a time she had hoped one life would flow into the other. Life, however, had kept its tributaries separate. Lu's eyes flicked to the tray of glasses the lacquered woman had ordered. He glanced at the men who leaned forward, and then he returned to Shi. Do you still... He hesitated for a breath, the smallest crack in the armor. Do you still work on the heart project? Her answer surprised her more than it did him. I lead it, she said. The words did not bristle, they clarified. I haven't given it up. For a breath, the room noticed nothing else. The CCTV of a private history. Then the lacquered woman clicked her nails together and threw a laugh sharp as a shard. She's a waitress now and leads a project, she said, loud enough for the room to hear the intended mockery. What a role reversal! Tell us, sweetheart, which life pays better these days? Shi's fingers tightened on the glass she held. Somewhere in her chest, the old steady rhythm paused and then resumed, small and stubborn. She did what she always did. She answered with an evenness that came from so much practice being calm. Neither, she said. Both. Enough to keep my daughter fed and under a surgeon's care. The words, delicate, private, hit the lacquered woman like a cold draft. The room grew quick with the smell of small, uncomfortable moral judgment. The men shifted, uncertain. They had been playing with the idea of someone to mock. Reality had arrived, raw and uncompromised. Lu stood, the world tightening to the two of them. His voice was low when he said to the lacquered woman, Perhaps you should excuse yourself. There are more important conversations here than the entertainment you provide. The woman flushed, vexed that she had been called by anyone, let alone by him. Around them a ripple of whispers moved like wind through paper. Then the lacquered woman rose, collecting outrage like jewelry, and made her exit with as much dignity as she could assign to it. The men at the table followed only after their sense of sport had been exhausted. After they had gone, the bar felt suddenly quieter. Not the ordinary lull after laughter, but a deeper hush, the kind that arrives when something honest has been exposed and people don't know how to look at it. Someone changed the record on the jukebox. A distant song filled the pause with a harmless melody. Lu slid into the stool opposite her. His coat smelled faintly of cedar and antiseptic, of boardrooms and hospitals, both places he frequented. He was the kind of man whose life was an argument made in polished sentences. He had the habitual skill of making complex things sound simple. You look tired, he said, and the observation had nothing of condescension. It was an inventory. There's a child at home, she said. She swallowed. Saying the medical words aloud felt like leaving the room with a door open. A congenital heart condition. The surgeries are expensive. We know, Lou interrupted gently. Your project, Heart AI. I've read the papers. A memory caught her. 10 years ago, a different room, stained with cheap coffee and long nights, their hands passing a circuit board between them like a promise. The youth in him had been hungry, the youth in her resistant and hopeful. They had been on an upward slope together, until a fracture, ambition, and a family mandate and the implacable decisions of adults pulled them apart. They had kept each other like relics, present enough to ache, absent enough to be guesswork. You left, she said, the statement more fact than condemnation. He had left on a morning that smelled of rain and leftover bread, and the space he had vacated had become a small, permanent architecture in her life. I had to, he replied. There were things I couldn't, things that were decided for me. The bar's light found him at the juncture where power met regret. He could have been more defensive, less human. Instead, he looked tired, perhaps for reasons she understood, and perhaps for reasons he had yet to name. You could have written, she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a ledger entry. 10 years had taught her the arithmetic of absence. I tried, he said simply, but perhaps I tried the wrong way. I've been looking for you for 10 years, Shi Yue, not as a headline or a problem, but as someone who mattered to me. The air shifted. For her, the words landed like a small, bewildering reprieve. For him, speaking was a risky reconciliation. For both, the publicness of it, this bar, these strangers, made it something larger than a private wound. The lacquered woman's parting words still echoed in the corners of the room like echoing glass. Why now? She asked. The question had many layers. It wanted the rawness of a story told plainly. Why return? Why stand here now? Because I found out about Xinjiang, he said, naming her daughter without preamble. The name felt like an offering. And because, he hesitated, because the project you lead is the only chance I know to fix more than one heart. She felt a coldness she would later recognize as both fear and calculation. The Heart AI project, her team's AI that could help optimize donor-recipient matching and surgical planning, was a fragile thing at the edge of commercial viability. They needed $30 million in the next quarter to scale trials, a figure that loomed like a cliff and clarified every day into binary stakes, fund it or fold. She had spent 10 months cajoling small grants, and the remainder asking for loans she had no way to guarantee repayment for. Tonight, she had come to this bar to do what she had to do to feed Xinjiang's appetite for life. Serve drinks, listen to gossip, take the tips. Lou's hand came up and rested, carefully, on the rim of the glass she had been polishing. Tell me everything, he said. Start at the beginning. She began where she always began, with the small facts that led to the large ones. Xinjiang, at 2 months, had begun to cough with a noise that quieted the room. Professor Shen had said the words congenital heart defect as if it were a mechanical diagnosis and not a tremor in a mother's chest. The surgeries had come in brackets of hope and despair. The first one had been paid for by a relative's loan. The second had slipped like water through her fingers. The third required a donor match, a compatibility that was both scientific and impossible, like finding a particular note in a vast orchestral room. Lou listened, the environment shifting to a private conference chamber around the kitchen light. He asked about Professor Shen's assessment, about potential transplant windows, about the project's timeline. He knew the clinical words, not as a layman, but as a man who had staffed hospital boards and had sat in meetings where decisions were made by calendar and by sense. He also knew the corporate language of investment. He asked about burn rates and milestones, but with a softness that suggested he intended his interest to be broader than a line item. 30 million, he murmured at last. You need 30 million to get to the point where clinical partners will commit. She could not have lied. 30 million, she repeated. If we have that, we can demonstrate sustained accuracy in donor matching. If we can show that, insurance partners sign on. It scales. Everyone benefits, including children like Sinyang. Lu's jaw hardened. I'll make some calls, he promised, a man stepping into the machinery he had been trying to steer for years. It was not a contract, it was an opening note, but it was something like salvation. And later, she would count each moment of kindness and harbor it against the nights when there had been none. The bar shifted back to its regular rhythm. Conversations reassembled themselves. She finished her shift with hands that ached, but with a certain resolve that came from not letting doors close without testing the frames. When she returned home that night, her apartment smelled of porridge and the slow, forgiving kiss of rice boiled long into tenderness. Sinyang greeted her with a small paper crown the child had made at school, unbothered by the world's legalities, by the economic ledger of adulthood. The child's smile was a simple code she had learned to read. Curiosity and hunger and the stubborn constancy of a small heart. Mom, Sinyang said, tugging the hem of Shi's sleeve, did you meet a prince tonight? She laughed, a sound that opened something inside her. No princes, my little engineer, only men who think money can buy everything. Sinyang frowned at the notion. But my heart, she said, tapping the chest with a child's certainty, needs more than coins. It needs, the child searched for the right word, a friend. At the hospital, days later, the monitors made their own music, precise and pragmatic. Professor Shen moved with the easy authority of someone who had held many fragile things and learned their songs. He permitted no grand statements, only clinical orders dressed in calm. We will prepare for surgery, he said, but the match will be the determining factor. We need compatible blood types and tissue compatibility. We need a donor. Donor compatibility had become a small industry of hope. There would be blood tests and coordinates and weights that felt like suspended promises. When the hospital's inventory of compatible donors came up short, the conversation about donors widened to include networks, appeals, and the possibility of living donors. Each option meant risk, procedure, and a degree of private courage that most people never had to tally. Professor Shen recommended caution and rigor. He also recommended that she consider enrolling in the new planned trial if the project could get enough funding to scale, a practical step toward future security. The funding negotiations moved like tectonic plates. She stood before investors in a conference room whose glass walls drank light and refracted it into calculation. She was no longer the quiet waitress. She was the lead, with meticulous slides and the kind of stubborn optimism that had kept her awake for nights. Her voice, when she spoke of the algorithm's ability to reduce mismatch risk by a measurable percentage, carried a quiet authority born from relentless rehearsal and a conviction carved by motherhood. But the world of capital had its own hunger. Investors wanted exits and revenue curves. Someone mentioned a competing firm with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. There were whispers about patents and whether a better-funded competitor would buy out the smaller team once the proof of concept was clear. Emotion had to be translated into deliverables. She knew how to translate. She also knew that numbers alone would not save Sinyang. They could alleviate money's immediate pressure, but they would not hold a child's hand under anesthesia. Lu's involvement grew like tidewater. He had ways of opening doors without making noise, of nudging people into conversations they hadn't planned to have. He introduced a soft, steady pressure that made some investors less eager to play games. He did not do it with the brassiness of a savior. He had his own reasons, a family history complicated by dominance, a mother who measured human relationships as collateral, and a regret that had sat in his chest for too long. His mother, Lu's mother, was the matriarch who moved like a map over their lives. She could call on favors and wield reputations like currency. She watched her son deepen his involvement with Shi from the periphery like a chess player studying an unexpected opening. Her objections were not only to the personal history. They had to do with the optics of reputation, with alliances, and with the fact that she had plans for the company that did not include emotional entanglements. One evening, in a room smelling of jasmine and ambition, she made an offer that clarified everything it touched, money and conditions. Legal phrasing had the effect of a scalpel. It excised future rights, responsibilities, and the hope of a claim. The offer was a clear equation: financial security in exchange for custody concessions. A contract laid out terms that favored her family's interests and minimized Shi's claims to co-parenting. It was precise, professional, and, to Shi's ear, a kind of violence. "Sign this," Lu's mother said, handing over the paper as if it were the morning's newspaper. "You will have support. You will have health care for Sinyang. You will not have to worry about money again." The paper detailed a trust, secure payments, and coverage for medical expenses. It also had a clause tucked like a sting: visitation controlled by the trust's board, with approval needed for any major decisions. It would make Shi dependent while simultaneously binding her freedom in a glossy legal loop. She understood why the offer existed. She also understood what it asked of her: to surrender a portion of the life she had managed to build by scraping nights and ruthlessly saving smiles. To sign would mean sleep without gnawing waking fears. It would also mean handing over a piece of her child's life to decisions she might never make again. "Let me think," she said, her voice small but not naive. Lu's mother smiled in the way people smile when they think the world is a well-ordered place. "Think quickly," she said. "There are others who would prefer not to invest in your project if there's a custody fight." It was a threat that hid itself as concern. For the first time, she saw clearly that some battles were being fought with a different kind of weapon: reputation. She thought of Sinyang's paper crown and the way the child's hand fit into hers like a familiar glove. She thought of the long nights at the bar and the long days in the lab. She thought of the heart that needed a donor and the algorithms that needed funding. She understood, cold as winter, that choosing between money and custody was a false binary designed by people who measured value with their own convenience in mind. "I won't sign anything that takes Sinyang away from me," she said. Lu's mother regarded her with the mild disappointment of one who had expected to cajole and be obeyed. "You will ruin the girl's life if you do not accept Shi Yue," she warned, as if mercy was a commodity only she could dispense. Outside, autumn made small, decisive changes to the air. She stepped out into the night's bracing cool and leaned against the stone of the building, feeling the city's hum. Inside her chest, the rhythm of blood and worry beat a steady, complicated measure. She had a choice: take the money and cede influence, or refuse and fight with the only weapons she trusted: stubbornness and truth. There were other moves, too. Lu came to her with options that were practical and complicated. He offered discreet introductions to investors who might fund the project's proof of concept without strings. He proposed speaking to his mother, confronting her, using his public position to make it socially costly to act purely on self-interest. He told her, off the record, about the way his family had influence and how that influence could be a lever. She accepted his help warily. She had learned over the years that letting someone into your life was a negotiation between safety and control. She accepted because sometimes survival meant letting a hand help raise the weight. At the same time as the corporate chess shifted, the hospital had its own urgencies. Tests showed that Sinyang's window for a successful match was narrowing. There was a possibility of a living donor, an adult relative whose tissues matched sufficiently to reduce the risk of rejection. Finding one would be like threading a needle in midair. Professor Shen and his team expanded their search, placing careful appeals to networks, reaching out to registries, coordinating with volunteer groups who organized donor drives. Public appeals were a tricky currency. They attracted compassion, which could be generous and fickle in the same breath. They also exposed the family to scrutiny and to the kinds of commentary that shredded dignity in the name of interest. She refused public pity. Instead, small circles of friends rallied around her. Neighbors who organized a fundraiser, an assistant at the lab who cashed out overtime, the bartender who covered a night of her shifts so she could be at Sinyang's bedside. In a quiet moment between meetings, Lu took Shi to a private room in the hospital. The walls were the bland, careful color of places designed to soothe nerves. Machines hummed like restrained bees. He stood by the window and watched a patient's curtain shift, not quite understanding why a man who had built companies could have been absent for a decade and could now speak with the particular urgency he did. "I can make certain calls," he said. "There are people who owe me favors. I can nudge and prod, but I can't force a donor to come forward, and I cannot buy time." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, the history between them felt not like a scar, but like a map showing the routes they both had taken. "I'm not asking you to buy time," she said. "I'm asking you to stand where you stand and use it well." He smiled, the expression brief, private. "I want to. For Sinyang, for you." They had fights later, quiet ones about the nature of help. He could not entirely remove the smell of strategy from his kindness. She could not entirely remove the mistrust that had kept her safe. But in the center of these fractious negotiations was a small, stubborn warmth. Neither of them wanted to lose the child. Meanwhile, at the company's annual summit, the stakes of the Hard AI project were made public in more ways than one. Investors flocked to a presentation where she stood on a stage under a white light, the logo of the project behind her like a banner of quiet ambition. She wore a plain suit, her hair pinned in a practical knot, and her voice carried without ornament. She walked the audience through the algorithm's architecture in a way that made even the skeptics thoughtful. Lu watched from the front row, a presence of stability. Beside him, his mother observed as if cataloging evidence. The room was the public stage the DNA of the project needed. It was also the place where private histories could be announced in ways that shifted reputations. A rival company had placed a smug advertisement in the morning's papers, implying that Heart AI was a fledgling, untested idea. The implication was that only heavy-pocketed competitors could bring such solutions to scale. The ad had been designed to rattle small investors. Shi's presentation cut through that noise. She spoke about outcomes and ethics, about how the algorithm did not just speed matchings, but reduced risk percentages that translated into fewer surgeries for some children. She told a story, not the whole of Sisinyang's life, but a small, human anecdote about a child's paper crown and the stubborn courage that spurred the team forward. When she finished, the room sat in a suspended hush, the kind that comes before either applause or critique. A voice from the back, the lacquered woman's echo perhaps, attempted to make the room's mood petty. But the floor shifted. An investor stood, a woman who had kept silent through much of the meeting, and announced a private commitment. It was the first of several, small but significant. The crowd began to stir with numbers. Backstage, in the corridor of fluorescent lights, Shi's phone buzzed with messages. There was a note from Professor Shen. A donor with partial compatibility had been located in a nearby city. It was cautious language, careful not to promise too much. The medical world demanded that caution. The note also said there had been another development. Legal counsel had flagged the custody contract as potentially coercive, given the power imbalance under which it had been presented. There were avenues for challenge. The heartbeat motif that threaded their life, literal and metaphoric, found new resonance in Shi's chest. In private, she allowed herself a small, impossible hope. The project was moving, the medical net had widened, the legal posture had brightened. That night at the bar, the lacquered woman circled back, hoping for further spectacle. This time the room's mood had changed. People who had laughed the night before watched but offered no cruel commentary. The social math had altered, the room calculated new bets. When she approached Shi, a different expression washed over her face, an anxious, corrective humility. I'm sorry, she said, in a voice that tried to sound contrite and found that it sounded raw. A chorus rose in the background, not wholly genuine. Apologies of convenience often felt the way rain feels when it knows, insufficient. But the sight of them was not useless. Lu's presence lent the moment an inevitability. The lacquered woman's friends, who had mocked the waitress, now stammered apologies that were more about restoring social balance than true contrition. Lu watched the exchange with an almost anthropologist's curiosity. People rearrange themselves when the stakes shift. He had been on both sides of that calculus, and it made him wary. He wanted apologies that meant change, not social laundering. When the lacquered woman reached out, she accepted the apology with a restrained, maternal politeness. It would be years before the trust was repaired, and perhaps never wholly. But she understood the smaller utility of letting an apology stand without turning it into a demand for gratitude. The public's attention had settled on the interplay between the shy waitress and the CEO. Gossip columns fed off fragments, and for a day the story was a small, consumable drama. But in the private corridors where real decisions were made, the press was irrelevant. There were donors to track and legal strategies to plan and a child's surgery to schedule. The hospital prepared for the donor. Tests were scheduled in close succession, each appointment a bead threaded on a fragile string of possibility. The living donor was nervous, as any person should be. There were meetings with surgeons who explained risks in professional tones, offering no platitudes, only options and consent forms. In the corners, friends held hands. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and hope, the two combining into a peculiar, almost sacred scent that those who had lived through such days would recognize. She sat beside Xin Young's bed that night and traced the child's hair back from the forehead, fingertips learning the map of a small life. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, unsure if the statement was a promise or a prayer. Xin Yang, who had once announced that her heart was an engine that liked to race for fun, pressed a tiny hand into hers and squeezed. "Okay," she said, simply, the word a talisman. Outside, city lights burned with the indifferent constancy of small suns. Lu, from his own apartment, stared at the company's financial dashboard and then at a photograph on his desk. An image from 10 years ago, when he and she had been younger and badly versed in survival. His mother called with controlled concern, and he answered with patience. He found himself walking the thin line between allowing his mother to act in ways he disagreed with and using his own power to hold the space she needed. He had learned, late and stubbornly, that influence is not a wand to be waved, but a responsibility to be steadied. In the days before the scheduled operation, small tremors of crisis arrived like predictable rain. A last-minute donor incompatibility was flagged, a test result that required rerunning. A key investor postponed a meeting until next month. The project team hunkered down and rerouted work, prioritizing the elements that aligned with immediate medical needs. There were nights when Shi's head ached from numbers, from negotiations, and from the sterile lullaby of beeping monitors. On the eve of the scheduled surgery, Professor Shen walked into the waiting room and gathered both of them, Shi and Lu, in his clinical steadiness. "We will proceed with caution," he said. "There are risks. We have done everything we can within the limits of current medicine. Your daughter is in good hands. We will call when the surgery begins and when it is complete." Shi's hands found Lu's in a simple human clasp. For the first time since their reconnection, they stood as partners in the most literal sense. Two people who would wait in a sterile room and take turns speaking the names of things they loved. As the corridor doors clicked behind the surgical team and the operating room folded itself around a single projected rhythm, a small mechanical heartbeat in the far corner of the waiting room continued its patient counting. Both of them watched it as if the machine had been designed to ease human anxiety. When the nurse came back, her face was composed. "The surgery went as planned," she said. "She's in recovery. We will keep her in ICU for monitoring, but the immediate procedure was successful." The relief that rose in Shi's chest felt like a new kind of light, shaky, fragile, but blinding in its own way. The machine's steady beep was no longer merely a background. It was providence rendered in a clinical tone. Lu's mother arrived not as a tyrant, but as someone who had watched events unfold in the way the powerful sometimes do, with a combination of curiosity and a recalculated sense of what was expedient. She offered an apology that was less grandstanding than a thinly veiled attempt to reinsert herself into a narrative she had mismanaged. She accepted without ceremony. The contract stayed unexecuted. Legal avenues opened not because of threats, but because truth had a way of being vindicated in the light. In the following weeks, the project made incremental gains. Investors committed small tranches, enough to scale a pilot. Heart AI's validation dataset grew with new clinical partners. Shi's team worked in shifts, their faces pale with fatigue, but alight with the kind of hope that softened even the most tired features. At an impromptu press conference to announce a new clinical partner, Lu stood beside Shi and introduced her not as a shy waitress rescued by an indulgent CEO, but as the project's leader and the child's mother, two roles she held with equal validity. The lacquered woman's contrition had been replayed in the gossip columns, and men who had laughed were now choosing their words carefully when they mentioned Shi Yue in public. When he placed a hand lightly on her shoulder in front of cameras and investors, he whispered, "I've been looking for you for 10 years, no longer as an old ache, but as an acknowledgement of a future that might at last be shared." She took the hand for a second, feeling the pulse of his palm, familiar, steady, and no longer merely a memory. Around them, the microphones recorded the moment that would become an image filed in people's minds. The CEO standing beside a woman who had been underestimated, the child whose small life had pulled strangers into action, and the project that had become a possible instrument of mercy. But there was more to be done. The project still needed significant funding to reach trial scale. The legal contract still loomed for another negotiation, and the social fractures needed tending in ordinary, unglamorous ways. People who had once mocked now demanded forgiveness. Sometimes forgiveness is earned, sometimes it is given, and carries with it the quiet work of rebuilding trust. She walked home that night beneath a sky that had the cleansed ache of rain. In the pocket of her apron, she kept a card Lu had slipped her at the bar, the same card that he had once slid and which now carried his new number and the soft suggestion of partnership. She could have been sentimental and scolded herself for it. Instead, she placed the card in a small drawer and slept with Sinyong's small hand curled over her chest. At dawn, the city woke to the same rhythms as always. Cars, deliveries, the claim of ordinary lives. But for Shi, a new rhythm had begun to set. It was tentative, threaded through with anxiety and the kind of hope that could be carefully managed. There would be board meetings and fundraising lunches, nights of waiting and days of paperwork. She would return to the lab and to the bar and to the headache of trying to balance necessities with aspiration. Lu, too, stepped into a new set of responsibilities, some self-chosen, some that others would attempt to define for him. He spent a morning walking the hospital corridors with Professor Shen, speaking quietly about the potential of the project and about the patience required to see clinical programs through their early, fragile phases. He had the power to call in favors, but he also knew that power had to be exercised with discretion lest it become another form of coercion. For their part, the lacquered woman and her cohort offered their apologies in public. Some were genuine and slow to take root, others were performative and thin. People who had once mocked Shi now asked to be photographed beside her at charity events, and the camera's flash flattened deeper feelings into polite smiles. She let some of those images happen because the necessity of enlarging the project's reach sometimes required alliances she could not pretend to disdain outright. Night after night, the little apartment filled again with porridge and small jokes. Sinyoung's appetite returned in delicate degrees. She found joy in a toy car and in the way her mother still managed to make a hunk of store-bought cake taste like celebration. She learned to accept help without thinking it a defeat. She also began to sleep with fewer knives of fear in her dreams. What remained unsaid, carried in both their bodies, was the cautious negotiation of affection and history. Lu's presence could be a harbor or a hurricane, depending on how both of them navigated the entangled necessities of power and vulnerability. They had been young once, and young people make mistakes that become the architecture of adult caution. Now, older and with more to lose, both had to decide if past affection could translate into present partnership. The city, which had watched their brief public reconnection with the amusement reserved for serialized romances, would balk and cheer in equal measure as the story progressed. But inside the quieter rooms, laboratories, hospital waiting areas, the bar's back office, real, unspectacular work continued. People arranged tests, negotiated funding tranches, comforted a child at midnight. One evening, as leaves began to move with more insistence toward winter, Lu stood before Shi in the little kitchen of her apartment. He had an offer, he said, a public proposal that would change everything in the company's optics and perhaps in their personal trajectories. She braced for grandness. Instead, he offered something smaller and more precise, a partnership in the project, with a trust built not on a contract presented at her detriment, but on legally safeguarded provisions that would let him commit resources while allowing her to retain guardianship and leadership. There are ways to do this that don't strip you of choice, he said. I can put my name on a commitment that ensures Sinyoung's care without a single clause that dictates your role as a mother. I don't want to buy your silence or your consent. I want to be an ally. She looked at him, the question in her eyes plain. Why now? Because I finally live in a world where I can choose differently, he said. Because you have been doing more than anyone should have had to do alone. Because I do not want to spend the next 10 years wondering what might have been if I had acted sooner. There was a quiet between them then, the kind that was not empty, but filled with the complexity of two people learning to recompose trust. She could accept his help and refuse entanglement. She could accept his help and choose to guard herself. Either choice would be correct on its own terms. I will accept help, she said finally, on the condition that it's built around the child's best interests, not on optics, not on power plays. If you put your name on it, put your name on it to make a difference. He agreed. He placed his hand over hers, a gentle public contract without legalese. Two people exchanging a covenant more fragile and truer than any printed clause. Outside, the night held its steady watch, indifferent and magnificent. Inside, in the small apartment warmed by porridge and a child's laughter, two adults began the long work of reassembling something neither of them expected to find again. There were days to come of fundraising and ethical fights. There would be a major pitch at a medical symposium that would either secure the project's future or send it back into the wilderness of unfunded promise. There would be enemies who loved strategy too much and friends who misunderstood sacrifice. But for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of moving forward with a team rather than against an unscalable tide. On the morning of the symposium, as she adjusted the lapel of her suit, Lu slipped a small paper crown, Xinyan's handiwork, into her bag. "For luck," he said, voice low. She smiled and put it in her pocket. "For the heart," she said. They walked into the conference hall side by side. Papers rustled, the projector hummed. The audience leaned forward, hungry for a solution and curious about the woman who had once been labeled a waitress and was now the linchpin to a technology that might one day save children like Xinyan. In the crowd, among the courteous applause and the sharp questions, the world watched them, not as caricatures of yesterday's gossip, but as figures whose choices mattered. For once, the public narrative and the private truth had the space to converge. As she set her slides and the lights dimmed, Lu caught her hand beneath the podium, a silent signal. She inhaled and began, and the room, for a long hour, listened. When she finished, the applause was not the squawking of a society hungry for spectacle, but the sustained, thoughtful recognition of people who had seen competence meet compassion. Commitments were offered. A key investor rose and asked to speak privately with her afterwards. Professor Shen sent a discreet text, "Prepare for the next phase." Outside the hall, cameras flashed and voices rose. Among them, the lacquered woman approached, now genuinely contrite. She said softly, "I was wrong. I should not have mocked you. She accepted the apology. She had learned to measure apologies by their usefulness and by their truth. Sometimes chalking in the outlines of a broken relationship was the only practical piece of rebuilding. Lu, at her side, felt something close to relief. He had not only made a promise, he had seen it tested in the smallest of forums and found it did not crack. The night had not resolved everything, far from it, but it had affirmed one crucial fact, that putting one's resources, influence, and public face behind an idea could change the axis of possibility. Behind them, in a city that never slept, small heroes kept doing their work. The nurse in the ICU who had sat with Xinyan while the machine steadied. The bartender who had covered Shi's shift. The investor who chose to be kind rather than cynical. A network had formed, fragile, imperfect, but real. And in a quiet hospital room where the monitors still ticked and Xinyan slept with the slow, promising rhythm of a mended thing, she folded the paper crown and laid it beside the child's pillow. She whispered into the dimness, "We will make this work." The words more vow than prediction. Across town, Lu called his mother and spoke in tones that were neither confrontational nor servile. He asked her to consider custody as something that required partnership and respect rather than a calculated asset. He asked her to help ensure that the child's welfare came first. His mother hesitated. Old habits die slowly. But the urgency of the child's need, combined with the public visibility of the project, made continued stubborn opposition less tenable. The gears of power grind, and sometimes the weight of human need changes their direction. There would be more fights, legal, emotional, and moral. There would be nights of rostered vigilance at hospital bedsides and days of grant writing and boardroom navigation. But what had shifted was the balance. Where once she had been alone in the calculus of survival, she now had allies who were willing to step into the messy work without attempting to own her. Across the city, in a bar that had once been a stage of mockery, people began to understand something larger. That dignity could be quiet and unadorned. That leadership came in the form of those who bore the daily cost of courage. The lacquered woman learned what it meant to apologize without seeking credit. The men who had laughed found, in the slow cool of consequence, that humility could be the most uncomfortable teacher. And somewhere in the fold of small domestic rituals, a bowl of soup prepared with the same tenderness as a lab experiment, a child's laughter that made the tired become new, she kept a small card in a drawer, a reminder that 10 years could be lost and sometimes, unlikely as it seemed, found again. But the work was not done. The project's next phase required the largest round of money yet. The symposium had bought them time and attention, not guarantee. The rival company was still circling, and the legal contract still needed to be firmly closed in a way that protected Shi and Xinjiang. There were human relationships, too, that needed tending. The fragile scaffolding of trust between Shi and Lu, the matriarch's complicated remorse, and the team's need for steady leadership that did not buckle under public glare. As winter crept in, bringing a brittle clarity to the air, she prepared herself for the long haul. She would return to the lab to refine algorithms, to speak with doctors and counsel the team's direction. She would go to court with legal counsel who had been recommended by allies, and she would argue for the child's best interest in a language of both law and love. One morning, before a key board meeting, Lu took her aside in the hallway of the company headquarters. He put forward a public statement of support. No sensational declarations, only pragmatic commitments and an offer to join the board's interim steering committee to secure dedicated funding for clinical trials. It was risk for him and assurance for her. He did not ask for her forgiveness in an ostentatious way. He simply made himself useful. She accepted on the condition that her voice would remain central. No patronizing heroics, she said with a small, tired smile. No strings. None, he promised. Only partnership. They shook hands like two people agreeing to carry a heavy object together, one that might bend under missteps, but could be moved with sufficient care. The weeks that followed were a mosaic of small triumphs and looming threats. A critical investor meeting yielded a partial commitment, contingent on regulatory markers. The rival company launched a public relations campaign to discredit small labs, and an ugly op-ed questioned the feasibility of heart AI. She answered with data and with the quieter power of consistent performance. The lab produced a new validation result that marginally increased match probability. Professor Shen posted a discreet commendation in a medical newsletter. The world moved 1 degree toward possibility. At home, Xinjiang improved day by day, her appetite steadying, her laughter returning to its ordinary buoyancy. She drew pictures of hearts that looked like blooming flowers, and told her mother that one day she would fix broken hearts with a big wrench like the ones at the playground. She saved the drawings in a shoebox titled Proof. On a cold night, the bar's old neon humming, the lacquered woman knocked on Shi's door with something like contrition. "I want to help," she said, surprising even herself. "I may not understand science, but I can help with fundraising events, with appearances, with—" She looked at the woman and weighed generosity against the risk of being used again. The world had taught her to be cautious, but charity often arrived in awkward clothing. "If you want to help," she said finally, "help be quiet and useful. Bring people who can write checks and who will treat us like partners, not charity." The woman nodded, the kind of assent that could become practice if repeated often enough. Around them, relationships reshaped slowly, as if a city reheated its connections slowly over time. And then, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary week, Professor Shen called with news that demanded both celebration and restraint. A major research institution had agreed to join the pilot program if Heart AI could demonstrate its matching accuracy in a larger sample size. The funds associated would not immediately cover the full $30 million, but they would credibly move the project closer to its goals. And, crucially, would bring clinical partners who would stand with them in trials. She tuned the sound of his words with a scientist's caution, acknowledging both the victory and the long road ahead. She and Lu, in a small office crowded with printouts and coffee stains, mapped the next steps. The stakes had not diminished. They had simply become more attainable. And then, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary week, Professor Shen called with news that demanded both celebration and restraint. A major research institution had agreed to join the pilot program if Heart AI could demonstrate its matching accuracy in a larger sample size. The funds associated would not immediately cover the full 30 million, but they would credibly move the project closer to its goals. And, crucially, would bring clinical partners who would stand with them in trials. She tuned the sound of his words with a scientist's caution, acknowledging both the victory and the long road ahead. She and Lu, in a small office crowded with printouts and coffee stains, mapped the next steps. The stakes had not diminished. They had simply become more attainable. One evening, as a soft snow began to fall and the city's edges softened, Lu stood in the doorway of Shi's little apartment and watched Xinjiang arrange small toys into a line, the child humming a tune that had nothing to do with the concerns of adults. In the way children do, Xinjiang arranged the toys into a heart shape and declared solemnly, "My heart is okay now." She smiled and sat down, watching them both. The rhythm of the room was a small human music, plates soft against the table, a murmur of news from a radio, the padding of small feet. 10 years, Lu said quietly, echoing what had once been a search and now felt like a found path. 10 years, she agreed, and the two shared a small laugh that broke the tension like sunlight through curtains. Outside, the city continued its work of being a city, but inside the apartment, a fragile constellation had formed. A child whose life had been saved for the time being, a project that had survived the first storm, and two adults who had found a way to work together without either of them trying to consume the other. There would still be hard days. There would still be nights when the monitors beeped and the legal forms demanded attention. There would be opponents and small humiliations and the necessity of forgiving and being forgiven. But for now, the bar's neon felt like a distant memory transmuted into something larger, a public recognition that had begun with shame and had moved, with effort and stubborn decency, toward repair. When the morning came, the photo of the CEO standing beside the former waitress, no longer an insult but an image of mutual respect, ran in the morning paper. The caption tried to make it sensationalistic. Nobody knows the shy waitress at the bar is the CEO's beloved. But the story beneath the headline had depth. It told of a child's surgery, of a project's first clinical partner, and of a small, stubborn network of people who refused to let a child's life be measured by the size of a wallet. People who had mocked offered apologies. Some meant them, others wore them as armor. She accepted what would be useful and declined what would compromise her child's future. Lu learned, again and with renewed humility, how power can be used without erasing the dignity of the person it helps. And somewhere, during a late-night conversation, Lu took Shi's hand and said the thing he had said in the bar, but with a new resonance. "I've been looking for you for 10 years." She looked at him and for once let the long-accumulated ache of the decade dissolve into something that could be held without flinching. "And I've been surviving," she replied. "Now let's make sure Xinjiang gets to thrive." They walked forward then, two people whose lives had been scraped and rearranged, committed to a messy, imperfect partnership, to fundraising, to healing, to parenting, and, if it proved possible, to something that might one day be called love. Outside, the city shimmered with its small, indifferent grandeur, and the small apartment cooled to the hush of people sleeping. The Heart AI project, like a small engine, hummed in the background, patient, precise, and full of promise. There were battles to finish, speeches to give, investors to persuade, and a legal contract that would need to be dismantled and remade into a framework that protected rather than punished. But for the first time in a decade, she felt less like she was carrying everything alone, and more like she was part of a team that included unexpected allies and a man who had finally chosen to use his influence on the side of human goodness. The story was not over. It had reached a crossroads, and at that crossroads, a child slept peacefully, a project took its next step, and two adults decided to fight the next fight together. The rest would be earned, step by stubborn step.